The third status quo. Do you see what I see? I walked straight out and down to Branca's office, shut her door behind me and burst into tears. I hate crying. More than that, I hate people seeing me cry. You know, I never cried when Mum and Dad died. Not a single tear. I wanted to. God knows I tried. But the tears wouldn't come. I know objectively that I was experiencing grief, arguably of the deepest sort, but I suppose everyone grieves in their own way, and my way, it seems, didn't involve crying. So I don't know why I started to bawl in Branca's office. Repressed rage more than anything. That feeling of wretchedness, of not feeling wanted or worthy, had something to do with it. But disappointment was probably the main thing. Disappointment in Dan, Ian, but most of all in myself. I couldn't believe what a poor judge of character I'd become. It seemed I'd let myself be lulled by wishful thinking, allowing myself to believe in a dream. In that respect, I wasn't all that different from poor miserable Dan. On that subject, who would have thought that the label Walter Mitty would be quite so appropriate? Branca was an absolute wonder, of course. She walked over and wrapped her arms around me while I sobbed convulsively on her shoulder, tut-tutting all the while. Even once I stopped crying, I still had the hiccup-like spasms of aftershock. Branca continued to hold me. I suspect we broke a world record for hugging. Anyway, eventually she let me go and insisted that I sit down, still holding my hand. What happened? I told him. And how did he respond? What could he say? Actually, I lie, he did say something. He admitted that his wife had no idea he was in Melbourne. She thought he was in Kuala Lumpur all this time. She probably still thinks that. I'm so sorry, Justine, said Branca, squeezing my hand. She always knows when to say as little as possible. I was glad she wasn't trying to comfort me with words. What would have been the use? So what's happening out there now? She asked. I saw Ian go in after me. I imagined Dan's being asked to pack up his things and get the hell out of here. I still can't understand it. I liked him so much. He seemed like such a good boy. We say dobar, good nature, you know? Just goes to show how wrong we can be. I smiled through my stinging, bloodshot eyes and added, At least I wasn't the only one. That makes me feel a whole lot better. Thanks, Branca. And I squeezed her hand back. Could there be some explanation? Oh, really, Branca, I wish. Before I went into his office, I ran through every possible scenario. At first I thought Ian had planted the evidence, but most of the papers on the file were ones I'd personally punched and put in. Then I thought the article about Kuala Lumpur must have been a mistake. But I rang up an after-hours contact for Dixon's, and they told me he wasn't back from Malaysia, and did I want to speak with Sylvester Cox instead. No, it's all true, sadly. Branca is like my aunt, really. Some Slavic aunt I never knew. Such kind eyes, such wisdom, such poise, such grace. When I look at her, I have to wonder where I went wrong. She's married to a guy who's normal, for God's sake. I mean really, truly bog-standard normal. He sits with his wife when they watch My Kitchen Rules and Australian Story together. Okay, he works long hours and doesn't do any housework. At least he doesn't do it well, or often enough. But he mows the lawn and he fixes things around the house. He likes to potter about in the shed. He's a member of a cycling club. He loves Arnold Schwarzenegger and Sylvester Stallone movies. Apparently even Steven Seagal still gives him satisfaction. I always find it odd when a doctor likes violent movies. It seems counterintuitive to me somehow. But he doesn't go out drinking, he doesn't cheat, and most importantly, he isn't married to someone else. By contrast, consider the guys I've dated. I've gone from one bad relationship straight into the next. I wonder sometimes whether there's a single normal guy out there. I keep finding ones who I think are completely and utterly different from each other. Then one day I turn around and it suddenly becomes apparent they're exactly the same. It's almost as if there's this club out there of disguised idiots. The disguises don't even need to be sophisticated. They can be the sort you buy in the toy aisle at Kmart. Fake mustache and glasses. I'll fall for it. I always have and probably always will. When you're a working girl, you form the poorest impression of the male psyche and ego. You really do. Brittle, bitter, aggressive, misogynistic on one hand, weak, miserable, self-pitying and useless on the other. With the exception of a few disabled and elderly clients, the rest of my customers might as well have shared the name Nigel No Friends. I think it's because they had the same basic problem, self-centeredness. Maybe I'm looking at the entire gender through a warped lens, but the average man in the general dating pool doesn't seem all that different to me. Not right now, anyway. The problem is I'm an incurable and hopeless romantic. I don't want it to be that way, and inevitably I get sucked back in, again. I think that's what hurt me the most with Dan. I thought I'd found a genuine guy. For a change, I was attracted to someone nice. There didn't appear to be any bad guy element. No superficial charm or other manipulation designed to hide a self-serving nature, or so I thought. I loved the way I could read him like a book, and yet he didn't seem to have a clue. Stupid me. He turned out to be far more devious than I ever imagined. To think that I didn't even bother to ask the most basic question, are you married, separated, divorced, seeing someone? I took all of his vague references to house-sitting and other girls being history, etc. at face value. I never once wondered if he was running from something, someone. Didn't even think about his past. Actually, I assumed he was a bit clumsy with women. Probably hadn't had much experience. At the time, I found this cute. Here was someone seemingly naive, at his age. Had someone told me that he was married, I would have been floored. You only really get to know someone when you accumulate glimpses of their unguarded moments. You can only get these over time, and you have to be waiting for them. They tell you more, much more, than any posed photograph, which is next to useless if not downright misleading. What people like Ian and Dan do is flood you with posed photographs. They let you think you're seeing something real, but it's all carefully stage-managed. In Ian's case, it's a surfeit of manly charm, a protector, provider, man of letters, partner of reassurance and compliments. But underneath there is a coldness, a ruthlessness that chills you to the bone. You start seeing it soon enough, but you don't believe it because you don't want to, and you don't want the illusion shattered, and you let it go on far too long. The longer it goes, the harder it becomes to admit it to yourself that you've been had. They call it cognitive dissonance, I believe. Dan, as it turns out, wasn't all that different. His was the kind of charm that comes from vulnerability. Of course, Ian had none, so how refreshing it was to meet his polar opposite. Felt like mothering Dan even when we first met in Perth. But as things progressed, I realized he didn't just have the clumsy Danny Kaye persona. He had the confident Danny Kaye persona as well. There was his apparent knowledge of music and sound engineering, all gobbledygook to me. Tsar worshipped him straight away, of course. And God knows he needed and still needs some sort of older male role model, particularly at this point in his life. Dan seemed to fit the bill perfectly. Tsar wouldn't have had much time for the clumsy Danny Kaye. Then there was his cooking, which, to be frank, wasn't all that good. But at least he was trying, and he was enthusiastic, and I have to admit he was a darn sight better than I am in that department. Any awkwardness was curiously absent in the bedroom, too. The incongruity between Dan's confident persona and his clumsy one should have painted some sort of fuller picture. I suppose it did. I just chose to view that picture in the best possible light. I ignored important data, again. All the warning signs were there, of course. Mrs. Chu, for instance, his neighbour. I remember how she clearly called him Mr. Picklejig. I heard her. I just didn't want to believe it. I wouldn't even countenance the thought of joining the dots. In fairness to me, Dan did throw a few curveballs. In particular, there was his calmness and consideration under pressure. Even now, this seems totally inconsistent with a self-serving nature. I'm remembering his response to Tsar's collapse at Dan's first dinner. His valiant, albeit farcical attempt to defend my honour with Ian in the driveway. But in the end, this comes to almost nothing when stacked up against someone who, after almost 3 weeks, couldn't be bothered telling me he was married, who hadn't even told his wife he'd moved to a different state, and who was pretending to be someone else, living in their house, drinking their wine, wearing their clothes. Who does that? If Ian is the archetypal predator, Dan is the archetypal opportunist. I've been taken in by both before, but never so quickly in succession, and I thought I was becoming cynical. Well, let that be a lesson learned. Desperately wanted to talk more with Branka. Specifically, I wanted to tell her more about Ian. I wanted to tell her about his blackmail. But when it all boils down, Branka isn't my aunt, and while she might be my best friend, she's still my boss. I guess I'm just not ready to tell her about my past. In fact, I have no idea how she'd respond. I hope she'd respond well. I think she would. Then again, I can't be sure. Besides, it's my business. I shouldn't have to reveal it to anyone. Apart from all of this, I don't see what Branko could even do other than lend a sympathetic ear. Ian is just too powerful. There must be another way. Oh, if only he would just let go. I can't understand his obsession. Sometimes I feel like I'm a mouse and he's a cat. He's caught me and he's toying with me, enjoying it. Sadistic bastard that he is. I'm pretty sure that's exactly what he's doing. As he likes to say, he never loses. Yet I can't afford to let him win. I won't. I'll quit before that. I'll move interstate. Maybe I'll get my UK passport and move there. What I'd love to do is move to San Francisco to be near my Ama. But she's been in a retirement village since Agong died. Besides, what would I do there? And there's Zar. I don't expect he's going to want to move anywhere. Which brings me back to Dan. I don't know how I'm going to explain everything to the boys. Zar probably won't believe me at first. Then he'll be disappointed. Not just because of the music, but because he and Dan have gotten close. I notice that happens with guys. They bond over projects. And this 2-day project saw a lot of that male bonding stuff. Silvio too. He's been singing Dan's praises since he arrived. And all of this makes me doubly mad. It's such a good thing going here. Everyone was happy. Oh, how I wish that bubble hadn't burst this morning. What was that Connie Francis song on Monday night? Everybody's somebody's fool. I'd happily be somebody's fool. So long as I never found out about it. Ignorance is bliss. So I guess I can't decide if I'm angry at Dan for lying to me, or for being such a pathetic liar. Talking about the feeling of wretchedness and unworthiness, I've never been the kind who gets asked to join in. You know, for the get-together for coffee, the book club, the drinks after work, the girls' nights out. I keep expecting to find the right formula for making friends, but somehow I haven't. It's almost as if there's this invisible wall. I keep bumping into it, feeling my way across it, looking for a gap, but I don't seem to have managed to find one so far. Don't get me wrong, I have lots of friends, women with whom I'm friendly, or even socialize, but I'm not part of anyone's inner circle. I can have what seems like a heart-to-heart with someone, but the next thing I know she's organized a weekend away with mutual friends, and I haven't been invited. Right back to my days at high school, I was never popular. I thought it might have had something to do with my appearance. I was gangly and knock-kneed. My lips were too big, and I wore braces. Thank goodness for school uniforms, because I'm sure I never had any clothes that were remotely trendy. How I abhorred free dress days. In other words, I was a bit of a nerd. But then again, I didn't seem to get along with the nerds either. I had one good friend right the way through. Melissa was her name. She had a violent and possibly abusive father. The latter has dawned on me in retrospect anyway. And a neurotic alcoholic mother, who could be sweet but was absolutely useless. I'm ashamed to say I don't even know what became of Mel. She went off to Sydney after school. I went to Melbourne Uni. Then Mum and Dad died and my life changed completely. If anything, I always seem to get along better with boys than girls, which is ironic, given that I ended up in an all-girls school, and ironic given that I've just been slagging off the male gender. I guess I've always found getting along with men fairly easy, as friends anyway. It's only in relationships that things start to go awry. I mentioned my sense of isolation with my own gender to one of my friends, Chloe, the other day. She's actually a neighbour who lives around the corner. Zara went to kindy with her son Zach. The two Zs, we call them. Chloe was a young mum in the proper sense, and only 2 years older than I am. Somewhat irritatingly, she is inclined towards constant self-analysis. She calls me often and can be quite clingy. Lately she's joined some crazy religious group, which makes me even less inclined to hang out with her. I can't decide whether this religious phase is worse than her multi-level marketing phase. She was into something called PP2PP. Anyway, she was quite surprised by my comment. She thought I was impossibly glam, and the other mums were convinced I wasn't interested in hanging out with them. I'd be more inclined to believe Chloe if she wasn't always on the outer herself. I can see how she forces herself into groups. I mentioned book clubs earlier. Well, I know she basically bullied her way into one. A couple of women left in protest. Not that Chloe seems aware of this. From what I can tell, reading between her enthusiastic lines, what's left is a sort of uneasy ceasefire, a simmering resentment from some, a resigned acceptance from others, and a general feeling of impending collapse from all. Social entropy and Chloe are inevitable companions. How unsurprising she should end up being my best friend outside work. Speaking of work, I left Branca's office and headed straight home. I wasn't going to get any work done, and I didn't want to see Ian. As soon as I got in, I called my ama using FaceTime. I could see it was evening over in San Francisco, and that's always a good time to ring, although I rarely can because I'm at work. There are so many things I daren't discuss with ama. I love her dearly, but we inhabit different worlds. Hers is so straightforward and black and white, wrong and right. Unsurprisingly, as she's gotten older, her opinions have become more and more resolute, even if they are, by her generation's standards, avant-garde. She might be considered a radical in her family, but her belief systems are still informed by paradigms inherited from the middle of the last century. For example, she's nothing if not a feminist. On the other hand, she seems scarcely aware that the world has moved on since the time of Doris Day and Connie Francis. I hate lying to her, yet in some senses our entire relationship is built on a fiction. Principal among these is the view that I'm still the little girl she used to take for walks when she and Agong would visit, the one who listened to the family stories about hardship in Taiwan after the war, the one who sat on the kitchen bench and watched her make pickled cabbage and pork or sweet red bean soup. So instead of telling her about Ian or Dan, I asked her, "Ama, why do you think I can't seem to make friends? What is it about me? Am I that, I don't know, repulsive?" "Ah, dear child, the problem is you're like me. Other women feel threatened by you." Good old Ama. The conversation always seems to come back to her. Even when she is commiserating, somehow her glory days get dragged back into the conversation, but I don't mind. "They were always the same towards me, you know. When I was back at school, the other girls would whisper behind my back. They would laugh at my clothes and the patched holes, but I always knew that I could wear rags more elegantly than they could wear the finest dresses, and the boys saw it too." This is what I mean by avant-garde. It is so un-Chinese to speak this way. Normally we are expected to be self-deprecating, and compliments are deflected, sometimes brutally. For example, I once overheard my mother being told, "Your daughter is so clever." She replied, "Not so. She's really quite stupid, but she has wonderful teachers." Maybe that's why she and Ama never saw eye to eye. Maybe that's why Mum and I never saw eye to eye. In many ways she was more old school than my grandmother. "I believe you," I said to Ama, "but with me it's different." "How so? I see you. I'm looking at you now. You are beautiful. You are intelligent. You are also hard-working and kind. What else is there?" "Ama, I'm not competing with anyone." "Then they are jealous of you because you are talented. You are an artist. Artists like us are always envied and misunderstood. But tell me, why aren't you at work? And why have you been crying?" "I was upset by a colleague. It's a long story. I felt unwell and I went home. I'm sorry, Ama. I've just calmed down and I don't want to go through it again. Another time? It's not important anyway. I just work stuff." "Okay, just remember, Jingyi, 否极泰来." I'm sure it will be fine. Nothing ever stays the same anyway, for better or for worse. Things always change. 再见, my little one. 再见.